We go now from the Helldivers above to the dungeons below.
An ancient dungeon risen from the depths. Adventurers delve to find its secrets.
No one leaves its chambers alive. Will you be the first to survive?
Hey, I'm Zog.
And I'm Sprout. On this episode of Well Played, we have a special guest.
Hey there, I'm Lamrock, your local plane-hopping tavern keeper.
On Well Played, we go over fantastic games, what makes them great, and some of what we can learn from their design.
Today we will be talking about Ancient Dungeon VR, a roguelite dungeon crawler with randomly generated dungeons, a variety of areas to explore, enemies to fight, and relics to aid you in your descent.
We start our adventure in the above-ground camp, where you can buy insight upgrades, upgrade your weapons through augmentations, and find the opposing Black Abyss, the dungeon from which no one has escaped.
You seemingly drop into an unknown world, filled with strange creatures, traps, endless hallways, and even holy underwear, where you fight through floor after floor trying to get to the exit. You find ancient relics, markings, secrets, and even friends, only to be taken from the depths of the dungeon, allowing another to follow in your path. Maybe at one point you make it out, but the opportunity for more leads you back in as the loop continues.
There are currently 5 areas to explore with varying enemies and challenges included. Each area is equipped with randomly generated rooms with varying amounts of loot and enemies, as well as possible traps, a merchant with a selection of relics, items, and marks, as well as a secret, hidden rooms with possible rewards or lore materialized as pages, and a boss room at the end.
Starting from the top, there's the overgrown gatehouse. As the name implies, it's an overgrown part of the dungeon with grass, vines, and the odd campfire left by previous adventurers. The next is the infested dungeon, an infested, fungi-ridden version of the overgrown gatehouse with wall-mounted explosive pustules and an equal amount of traps. After that nasty experience, you end up in the Forgotten Library, a glowing magic library. This is where you find portals that teleport you into possible danger, and more books than the Harry Potter franchise that you face against in a game of tennis. Then into the Luminous Mines, a crystal-ridden mineshaft forgotten in time, with minecarts that, if hit towards enemies, cause a considerable amount of damage.
And finally, you reach the end at the Beast's Cradle, which involves a gray atmosphere and a red-eyed tentacle turd standing in the way of you finally leaving the dungeon alive. Now that we know what areas are in the dungeon, let's delve into what inhabits them.
There are a variety of enemies that appear within the dungeons. Starting in the overgrown gatehouse, there are slimes that jump at you, zombies that walk or charge towards you, and aggressive plants that spit homing projectiles.
The further you go, different enemies start to spawn. While in the infested dungeon, there are similar enemies to the overgrown gatehouse, like slimes, zombies, and fungi with the effect of toxic spores added to them, which disappear over time.
In the Forgotten Library, there are sentient books, as said before, that spew spells at you, which you can either dodge or hit back towards your enemies to destroy them. There are also disc-throwing elementals, laser beam crystals, and the worst of them all, the phase slime. In the Luminous Mines live skeletons that charge, lunge, and throw pickaxes at you. Stone slimes that causes spikes to erupt from the ground in a line towards you. Bone slimes that, if killed, release projectiles in 3 different directions. And even mimics disguised as chests.
Each area progressively gets harder as you go down, and it seems as though some enemies share an ability of the boss from that area, preparing the player for what comes next, and making the boss's abilities feel familiar. This makes each area feel cohesive, and makes it important to pay attention to said enemies. Speaking of bosses, at the end of every level, a set of double doors will open, and when you enter the room, a boss will appear, which you must defeat in order to continue further into the dungeon. When you defeat a boss, you are granted a food item for healing if you have the upgrade, and a random relic, or in the case of multiplayer, 1 per person.
There are different bosses the further you go. The overgrown gatehouse can have one of 2 bosses, being the King Slime and the Deranged Adventurer. King Slime will slowly hop towards the player menacingly, and every time it is damaged, it will spawn a slime, and can also do a charge attack against the player. And when too many slimes are around, he gains an invincibility shield until enough slimes are cleared.
The deranged adventurer is a large zombie who swings his great club in an attempt to hit the player. When taking enough damage, he will recoil, then jump into the air, slamming the ground, sending spikes towards the player.
In the infested dungeon, there's the Doom Shroom. It sporadically jumps into the air, falls to the ground, releasing spores all around it. And similarly to the King Slime, will do a rush attack, although this one is much further and faster.
In the Forgotten Library, there is a book. Lord, help us all. The book will teleport around the room and shoot waves of yellow at the player, and after being hit 3 times, will open itself up and display a number. This shows the type of enemy that spawns within the room, and you have to defeat them before you can attack the book again.
Please, let it not be 1.
In the mines is the Elder Skeleton. He shoots wave of red, similar to the Rabid Bestiary, and will summon a cone of spikes at the player. When hit enough times, it will send a line of spikes in all 4 directions across the room and teleport to a different location.
And finally is the Beast. This monster of a boss has 3 phases. First being where he will appear from a black abyss, and his chained eyes will shoot at you. If not defeated fast enough, he'll retreat and start to summon red flames from the ground to try and hurt the player. After beating this first phase, you're teleported into a room where you'll have to fight a horde of skeletal heads that fly at the player rather quickly. Once out of the room, the beast will begin moving around the room and start shooting you with waves similar to the Elder Skeleton, and will also do a very large blast of red fire. After this phase, you are, once again, teleported, and have to fight the skeletal heads a second time. After your second time in the skull room, the beast will start teleporting around the larger room and charging at the player, and when defeated, will go dark, float up to the top, and you'll be left with a new lore page.
Each of the bosses are tailored to their dungeon's theme very well, and each of their attacks feel unique, fitting in with some of the other foes you faced in the dungeon beforehand. They provide a good challenge, and some can be outright lethal in the harder difficulties.
Throughout the game, you will be able to upgrade yourself through many different means. To start, we have the insight upgrades. These will change how your dungeon delve will be. Like being able to find hidden rooms, being offered food if your health is low by the merchant, and being able to find golden slimes, to name a few. There are also weapon upgrades called weapon augments. These will affect how your weapon works, like having your throwing knife be able to do full damage if it hits an enemy when recalling it, or making the explosion radius of your crossbow bolt bigger.
Throughout the dungeon, when exploring, defeating a boss, or visiting the merchant, you can get relics. These are upgrades that will last throughout your dungeon run, and will go away at the start of your next run. These relics can be as simple as gaining more damage at the cost of taking more damage, or as crazy as your projectiles being able to track their targets. And one of the upgrades is just beans.
While breaking pots and opening chests, you have a chance to find food, which will heal you a different amount depending on what type of food you found, with potatoes giving half a heart and dragon fruit giving 3. There are also orbs that give an effect when thrown, some of these being massive explosions, some making you move faster, or slowing time, or turning everything around you into gold.
With the vast abundance of relics and items, there are tiers based on the rarity, with the rare ones being quite special in their own unique ways. This always makes each run different, with some being good and some being bad, highly dependent on which relics you find. While this may be seen as luck-based, a good run is also heavily dependent on the user of the relics, and how they can use them to their advantage, even if it might not be a large one.
These orbs, relics, and foods affect your stats, some of which affect the player, while others affect the dungeon itself, or the abilities of other relics. Starting with the damage. Each weapon, whether it be your primary or secondary, has a damage type, either ranged or melee, which is adjusted by the relics you find around the dungeon. This also comes included with a crit chance, which also has its own sets of relics to adjust them. Then comes evasion, easily the most useful stat to improve. Its ability is the chance at which you won't take damage at all when hit.
After that are the stats that don't affect the player directly. These are the discount and luck stats. Discount, as you can imagine, affects the prices of items that the merchant is selling, but it goes both in the positive and the negative directions. If you mishandle the merchant or his goods, your discount could drop significantly, and you could be finding yourself paying a lot more than you were before. Reminds me of what's happening to my wallet in real life. Lastly is luck. This has a range of uses from helping you win big at the merchant's lottery machine to directly affecting an item's effect trigger probability.
Now we're on to updates. The single developer, the absolute unit he is, updates this game regularly and consistently gives out devlogs to keep the community in the loop. In the 5 years, give or take, that he has been developing the game, there have obviously been many hurdles and challenges, but he has never ceased from delivering.
The most recent update added to the game, and possibly the most difficult and rewarding update, was the multiplayer update. Because if you love a game, you'll probably love it a lot more if you're playing with friends. With a full lobby of 4, you can experience the dungeon with a whole new level of chaos.
Before multiplayer, a noteworthy update was the addition of the Sealed Souls, which added lore, mini-boss battles, and challenge runs. In this update, if you gathered all the lore pages on a specific Delver, you would find their ghost in a secret room that you must fight. After defeating Ghost, you unlock them as a challenge dive, with additional details and lores as you progress the run.
Overall, this game deserves a lot more recognition than it has been given. It's exceeded expectations for its combat, enemies, areas, and overall immersion. Especially for a solo dev, I can honestly say that this is an amusing and exciting experience that multiplayer only adds to.
The gameplay feels smooth and responsive, everything feels cohesive, the game has a unique art style, and overall it's rather well polished, setting it far above most other VR titles that release these days. So, what's the takeaway? What can we learn from Ancient Dungeon from a game development standpoint? Well, to be frank, it's pretty much the same conclusion we came to about VTOL. If you have a solid core gameplay loop, a concept that isn't just like 20 other games, and a passion for developing it, plus the willingness to talk to your community, the result is a decently popular and extremely fun game.
We go from the dungeons below to the castles above.
A new chapter risen from a legend long and forgotten.
This is a tale of magic and swords, of blade and sorcery. Oh, also, we have a Discord now. Join that if you want to hear more from and about us. Link in description.